The Giant class is a class of cards that is a core part of Clash Royale. For a while, we had Giant, Royal Giant, and Giant Skeleton, and although there are similarities between them, each of them have their own unique attributes to justify their existence. But ultimately, what a Giant card comes down to is being a blockade for more valuable troops. So if you wanted to add another Giant, how would you go about justifying its inclusion? How would it stand out? Well, Supercell did just that in September 2018 with the addition of the Goblin Giant, a 6 elixir epic card that would bring some interesting mechanics to the game, but be hard to properly balance and fit in because of them. This card's had a rough journey for the most part, but it's had some major developments in recent years, so today I want to cover his entire history. What does he bring to the game? Why did he underperform for so long? And how did he end up getting into the position he's in today? As I said before, Goblin Giant would be released in September 2018, but he was revealed in August 2018, and although first impressions weren't too bad, most players weren't exactly thrilled. The main thing that makes Goblin Giant stand out is 2 spear goblins on his back. Although the Goblin Giant would target buildings only, the spear goblins could attack troops. This could lead to instances where the spear goblins would be attacking something, but the Goblin Giant would ignore it and walk out of range, forcing the spear goblins to target something else. The spear goblins also could not be killed until the Goblin Giant was taken down. A common misconception of this card before it was released was that it was going to be sort of a combo card where the spear goblins would spawn as separate troops behind the Goblin Giant, sort of like Rascals. A lot of people were saying this card would be a good bait card because of this and that Rascals were going to be dead. But this was far more unique. No other card had a mechanic like this. Thanks to these spear goblins, things like bats or skeletons would get taken out very easily when going against the Goblin Giant. And there could be instances where they could assist in taking out a balloon or a graveyard. I know it sounds bad to be justifying 6 elixir to utilize 2 spear goblins that won't even sit still, but it goes to show that this card could be used in more defensive situations and be more than just a damage absorber. Having this little extra damage went a long way. It could save you a zap against bats or skeletons, or be paired with a zap to take out some beefier swarms. This wouldn't be the only thing to separate it from the other giants, however. Another major difference was that he moved at a medium movement speed rather than slow, which is 1.5 times faster. Goblin troops move faster than other troops, even the big ones, so this would be a major thing that helped it stand out. It was nice in the aspect that it would reach the towers quicker, but it would be much harder to build pushes behind. A card this massive moving this fast was awkward because it was the type of card you rarely ever wanted to send in without decent support. With giants, you typically wanted to place them in the back and stack a lot of troops behind them to overwhelm your opponent with a massive push, but with Goblin Giant, you would have less time for that. On top of that, he would have about 29% fewer hit points than the regular giant while only doing slightly more damage per second if you include the 2 spear goblins. Also, as a bonus, when he died, he would leave behind the 2 spear goblins, of which would then just act like normal spear goblins. This meant if you paired it with something like Miner, the Giant could tank for the Miner, and once it went down, the Miner could tank for the Goblins. It was imagined he would be good against things like Elixir Collector because of its higher pressure nature compared to other giants. Not only did the opponent have less time to react to it, but they couldn't really defend with 1 to 2 Elixir units to minimize damage taken. It was also expected to be a solid replacement to Giant and Giant Double Prince. Giant was a popular card at the time, so Goblin Giant was meant to siphon off some of those players. In fact, Supercell was so confident that Giant Double Prince would replace Giant for Goblin Giant that they actually included a Goblin Giant Double Prince deck in the Classic Deck mode that was coming back alongside this update. Classic Decks is a mode that doesn't appear in modern Clash Royale, but back then this mode was there to acknowledge some of the most played decks around the time, so including a brand new card in this mode was a bit odd. So how was the Goblin Giant upon release? Well, it's safe to say it landed a bit soft. Having way less hit points while costing 1 more elixir than the regular giant with a lame death ability was not exactly the most enticing option. You saw some players replacing Giant with it in a popular Giant 3 Musketeers deck that was going around at the time, and you also had this weird Battle Ram deck that won a few grand challenges, but ultimately it was clear that the other options were just better. Within just a few days of its release, it had fallen to a 0% use rate in grand challenges. There was never a reason to use this Giant over one of the other ones. It was so easy to counter since it offered so few hit points for its cost, and pretty much anything that took out the Goblin Giant would easily take out the Death Spear Goblins as well. Initially, its purpose failed. Those 2 little spear goblins did not make up for all the disadvantages it had. It's not a surprise it was released so soft though. Royal Recruits had released just prior to this as a game-breakingly overpowered card, and the devs received a lot of backlash because of it, so it makes sense why they'd release the next new card a little on the weaker side. But now that it was released and clearly not a threat, it would receive a buff. On October 1st, 2018, its health was increased by 6%, so now it would have about the same as the Royal Giant. This was a standard buff that no one disagreed with. It was a significant increase, but justified given how bad of a state it was in before. Following this change, this card was still widely seen as being a bad, low-tier card, but its performance afterwards was leading some to believe it was actually pretty decent because only a couple of weeks after the buff, it managed to have a 61% win rate despite only having a 1% use rate. These are very odd stats because a 1% use rate usually indicates that a card isn't very good since not a lot of players want to use it, but also any card that exceeds a 55% win rate is considered too strong and needs a nerf. Goblin Giant had the highest win rate in the game, in fact. A card should have had around a 9% use rate to be considered healthy, so it was still critically underused despite winning a good majority of the time. Seth, the community manager, commented on this saying that he believes the low use rate was attributed to a lot of people not having him leveled up yet, and that his high win rate indicated that over time the use rate would rise, and thus they would not be buffing him again soon. In case you didn't know, back in these days, you had to have your cards leveled up to tournament standard to use them at tournament standard and challenges. Epics were arguably the hardest rarity to get to tournament standard because commons and rares were the only rarities that could be requested regularly, and legendaries were automatically tournament standard at level 1. However, I don't think this performance can be explained by this alone, and time will prove that to be correct. But for now, let's observe what Goblin Giant was performing well in. As we've seen, he wasn't very popular, but there was this deck with Sparky that some players were finding success and winning grand challenges with. This dynamic duo worked surprisingly really well together. What made the combo so good for one thing is the spear goblins. Swarms were very often used to counter Sparky. Even skeletons could efficiently surround and fully counter it. Since Sparky was more of a threat, defenders would always try to kill it first in a push, but that would be much harder to do because the spear goblins would attack whatever was put on it. Any swarm would be way less efficient, and even some heftier units would get evaporated with the assistance of the fireball, zap, and or log. Giant didn't do any damage to troops, so if the opponent put, say, an Electro Wizard on Sparky, a fireball would almost but not quite take it out. But now, the spear goblins would finish it off. Goblin Giant brought up Sparky's potential in a way no other tank could. The community manager had been talking so much about minor and double print stacks, but the real best synergizer was undoubtedly Sparky. Goblin Giant from this point on would almost always be seen with Sparky. Again, this was not one of the most popular decks or even a meta deck, but it proved to be very threatening in the right hands. Both cards weren't very good on their own. Some referred to it at the time as the trash combo, Goblin Giant being the trash bag and Sparky as the trash can on wheels. As players got their Goblin Giant leveled up, we wouldn't see an increase in use and win rate. Instead, it would trickle down. Goblin Giant Sparky was appearing less and less frequently as time went on. By the end of the year, Goblin Giant was the second least used card in Grand Challenges, with his win rate dropping below 50%, which was a clear indicator he didn't have the potential people initially thought he had. At least, certainly not anymore. Only 1 week into 2019, Goblin Giant would appear in the balance changes again. His hit points would be increased by another 3%, and the spear goblins in his backpack would get a range increase of half a tile. The idea was that the spear goblins in the backpack had a higher vantage point, which allowed their spears to travel farther. On top of this, Sparky would be receiving a major buff. Since they had been working well together, it was basically an indirect buff to the Goblin Giant if you think about it. It was looking like it was going to be a great season for the card, but even with all of this, Goblin Giant's use rate was 1% in Grand Challenges by the end of January. Despite all the help it got, it wasn't enough to entice a healthy amount of people to use him. When you did see him, you always saw Sparky with him. Only with her could he get the bare minimum value you would need to justify playing him. It seemed like the buff wasn't enough at this point. He would need some more help, but he wouldn't be getting any more for a while. Despite having such a low use rate, he was still maintaining an excellent win rate, and according to Seth in a blog post in February, he had the highest win rate in challenges at nearly 60%. This would go on to be justification for not buffing it when asked about future potential Goblin Giant buffs. Why buff a card that has an absurdly high win rate? If it can be successful, it doesn't need any help. Some argued it was already a top tier card just because of its win rate and most people just weren't realizing it yet. But you have to wonder, if a card really can win so much, why is its use rate consistently so low? Seth himself said he believed the use rate was so low and win rate was so high originally because Goblin Giant was really good and players just didn't level him up yet. But even with all the time that had passed, plus above, he was still in practically the same position. This kind of logic sounds reasonable, but just doesn't play out in practice. Popular cards like Zap and Log often had win rates in the low 40s, and if you use this same logic, then their use rate should have trickled down since a lot of players were losing with them more than they were winning. But despite their win rate being low, lots of players continuously used them. I don't think that justifies leaving them to be as strong as they were. Goblin Giant was very niche. Although it could be very good in the right circumstance, it wasn't worth the time and effort for many players. Really, I think almost any move could have been justified here. It just depends on what the goal of balancing is. If the goal is to make every card's use rate as close as possible, then buff it, even if it makes its stats a little too valuable for its cost. If the goal is just to ensure it's viable and allow players who master it to win a little more than they should, then leave it alone. I think it was smart to leave it alone because if you buffed it in this state, then the players who were already succeeding with him could have potentially dominated. It was better to just let it settle and see where it went for now. It had similar stats to this before, but couldn't maintain them, so it was buffed after that fall. If that happened again, then I'm sure they'd buff it again. However, this time it was able to maintain its performance rates, so it would remain unchanged for the foreseeable future, and that was okay. Its use rate was trickling up over the coming months. There just wasn't a lot of variety in the decks he was viable in. At the top level, he was good, even arguably a little too much. But if you were a casual or average player, you probably didn't have a problem with it. Because the game is typically balanced around competitive stats though, this pretty much ensured Goblin Giant wouldn't be getting any help. In fact, it would actually be getting the opposite. On July 1st, 2019, Goblin Giant would receive its first nerf. This was actually a standardization change because of the new range categories. It was not meant to be a direct target towards this card, but alas, its range would be decreased from 1.25 to 1.2 tiles to fit into the new melee medium category. It's a very small nerf that was practically unnoticeable, but it meant that it took an additional 0.05 of a second for Goblin Giant to lock onto its target. If this standardization was applied just a few months earlier, I could have seen the devs boosting his range to melee long just to give him that little extra boost, but since his rates were slightly going up and he was really good in some competitively viable decks, it's more than understandable as to why they very gently decreased his range without any sort of compensative buff. The second half of 2019 was going to be interesting. In July we didn't really see any change, but in August we would see some more development. P.E.K.K.A. was rising and would dominate the meta in August, so you wouldn't really expect Giants to be popular, but it turns out this was actually a really good environment for Goblin Giant. This Goblin Giant deck became quite popular in August as it was designed to beat P.E.K.K.A. decks. It cost 4.4 elixir on average, which is way heavier than most meta decks, but it was very strong defensively that if you played it right, it could work really well. It had some glaring weaknesses for sure, but as long as it countered P.E.K.K.A. well, it could work fairly well in this environment. Thanks to this, Goblin Giant was able to hit its highest usage yet. It was finally closer to its expected usage rate. This was just a blip though, given the P.E.K.K.A. dominant meta as well as the strong defensive support of the overpowered Goblin Cage. With both of those cards getting nerfed in September, you saw Goblin Giant's rates return close to what they were before August. It was kind of incredible to see it maintaining okay usage consistently given how niche it felt. Usually cards in this kind of position aren't able to maintain it for this long because environmental factors change the very specific set of circumstances that allow it to thrive in its niche, but we weren't seeing a full drop off with Goblin Giant in any environment. Goblin Giant was still heavily relying on Sparky, which was strong. Sparky wasn't game breaking or anything, but if it ever got nerfed or fell out of the meta, then Goblin Giant would almost certainly fall off completely. And we would see that sort of play out in October. Sparky wasn't nerfed or anything, in fact she was the best she's ever been, but the new Elixir Golem was released that month and Sparky worked far better with that than she did with the Goblin Giant. Elixir Golem was generally overpowered, so that was going to shift once Elixir Golem was nerfed, but it really went to show how much Goblin Giant relied on her. Goblin Giant needed Sparky, but Sparky did not need Goblin Giant. For the rest of 2019, its Grand Challenge use rate failed to surpass 1%. There was really just no reason to use Goblin Giant over Elixir Golem. It was already barely staying relevant before, but this new development pushed it over the edge of viability. It's not even like Elixir Golem was a direct replacement for Goblin Giant. They functioned very differently. The main thing they had in common that was hurting Goblin Giant here was being a good Sparky synergizer. This one deck that blew up in August was really the only Goblin Giant deck you saw used competitively, but it was certainly not at its prime. After the Elixir Golem nerf in January 2020, we saw a slow trickle up of Goblin Giant's rates again. The Goblin Giant Sparky combo wasn't going off into the sunset yet. In March, you saw this deck with the Earthquake blowing up, which would carry it far. March through April was a big time for spawners, so having the Earthquake and Dark Prince was helpful for clearing up messes. By the end of April, Goblin Giant's win rate was still at 60% with a 6% use rate, which are very impressive stats. But once again, balance changes would stabilize this crazy environment in May, leading to another fall. For most of the rest of the year, there wouldn't be any interesting or significant Goblin Giant developments. Its use rate would hover around 3 to 4% with a win rate in the high 50s, and you'd see new Goblin Giant Sparky decks popping up as the meta evolved throughout the year. But little did anyone know that this was all going to change very soon. Goblin Giant had sort of a lackluster journey up to this point. It's never been prominent in the meta consistently, and the decks it had shown viability in were very specific. And as I said, Goblin Giant was fully reliant on Sparky. There had never been a top Goblin Giant deck that didn't include it. It's not healthy when a card relies on one specific card to stay relevant because the meta is constantly changing and almost always that card will fall out of the meta sooner or later. Cards that are relied upon for other cards to stay viable are usually too strong on their own, making it only a matter of time before they're nerfed. Sparky had avoided the nerf hammer for years because even though she was strong in a niche, she didn't have absurdly outlandish rates. But it had become more of an issue throughout the year, so in November 2020, it would get nerfed. And unsurprisingly, following the nerf, Goblin Giant's rates would fall to the lowest they've been all year. These rates showed that the card was not competitively viable. It was now officially the least used win condition. Even at its peak of the year, it had below average usage, but now with Sparky being significantly worse, it didn't have even close to viable rates. It clearly needed a buff at this point, and Supercell would actually waste no time letting Goblin Giant sulk, as it would appear in the very next set of balance changes. This would be the first time it appeared in the changes in a year and a half, nearly 2 years if you discount the small standardization adjustment. On December 9th, 2020, Goblin Giant's hit speed would be decreased by 0.2 of a second. Also, its first hit attack time would be decreased by 0.2 of a second. This was a pretty generous buff, but I think it needed something big given its current state. When dealing with Goblin Giant, you already didn't want it to connect to the tower, so when it was defended properly, the hit speed didn't really matter. Ultimately, its damage per second was increased by about 13% though, so it was much more worth supporting him now. Although this change did break a consistency, as before he had the same hit speed as the Spirit Goblins he carried, but that didn't really matter. Following this change, the card was pretty much in the exact same position it was in before the Sparky nerf, still being seen with Sparky only. It's as if nothing changed, but I think this was definitely much better because Sparky wasn't carrying all the weight. Sparky was a bit weaker and Goblin Giant was a bit stronger, so now Goblin Giant wouldn't have to rely on Sparky so much. And we could already start to see it branch off from Sparky, as in December, a Goblin Giant double Prince deck would begin to trend. This is the type of deck the devs expected Goblin Giant to work in well at the start, but that hadn't been the reality up until now. It had needed that nudge, and it finally got it. It's quite different from the one that appeared in the classic decks back in 2018, but they got the general idea right. It was looking like it was going to have a bright future, but Goblin Giant Double Prince did not trend for long, as the normal Giant was ultimately found to work better, and you went back to seeing Goblin Giant exclusively paired with Sparky. 2021 was probably the most nothing year for Goblin Giant. Its use rate hovered around 2 to 3%, and it maintained a high win rate for the whole year. Goblin Giant Sparky was evolving throughout the year as the meta changed. Elite Barbarians and Mother Witch were more commonly seen with Goblin Giant, and the Rage spell was also frequently seen with them as well. It was interesting because Rage was another one of those cards that was never really meta. It just thrived in a few specific off-meta niche decks. And that's pretty much the position Goblin Giant and Sparky were in for most of their lives, so it was interesting seeing all of them working together. Although because the Rage spell's levels didn't scale properly, decks with that spell specifically were working better on top ladder than in challenges. You would also occasionally see Goblin Giant Double Prince in competitive play, but it paled in comparison to regular Giant Double Prince. Goblin Giant was holding steady, but this wasn't going to last forever. Remember, even though Goblin Giant had one of the highest win rates in the game consistently, it had a very low use rate. I certainly wouldn't have called it meta throughout this period. We saw Goblin Giant pushed off the edge of relevancy when Sparky was nerfed in November 2020, and any development like that again could replicate that. Sooner or later, it was inevitable, and we would see this development in October 2022. This is where everything would change. We would see 2 new cards released in October, but the one we need to focus on for this video is the Monk. The Monk was a new 4 elixir champion that would hard counter Goblin Giant Sparky. It was tanky and had some very unique attributes. Firstly, it could push back any ground unit. Up to this point, the Log was the only card that could knock back Goblin Giant, but now the Monk could also do this, and much more efficiently, which made it very hard for it to connect when the Monk was focused on it. But the real thing that made it so threatening was its ability, Pensive Protection. This ability would reflect all projectiles when activated, meaning the Spear Goblin Spears and the Sparky Blasts. It was certainly more devastating for Sparky, but since Goblin Giant couldn't work well without Sparky, it was detrimental for it as well. With it being so prominent in the meta, it's no surprise Goblin Giant's use and win rate fell like a rock. Within only a few days of the update, it was the least used card in challenges. It had a worse use and win rate than Barbarian Hut and Wizard. Some players brought attention to the fact that Goblin Giant was doing so poorly and discussing whether or not he needed a buff. Some argued he was balanced and this was just a bad environment, but others wanted to see Supercell give it some love. Obviously the sudden drop was because the Monk and Phoenix were suddenly dominant, so that would maybe fix itself once they were properly toned down. But you have to remember that even before this update, Goblin Giant's usage barely surpassed 3% in the last few years. The average use rate for a card at this time was between 8 and 9%, but Goblin Giant wasn't even close to that. Its high win rate had been keeping it from being buffed, but even though it had that high win rate, it didn't feel like one of the best cards in the game. It wasn't meta, and a lot of pro players weren't even considering it. I know buffing a card with a high win rate can be dangerous, but I feel like the point of balance changes are to encourage players to use a card they aren't using, and Goblin Giant was certainly way below the ideal range of usage. Supercell was so overly cautious with Goblin Giant despite it never being considered overpowered. There had never been a broken Goblin Giant meta where it was used in a third of all decks and needed drastic nerfs. We didn't really know what a Goblin Giant dominated environment looked like. The theory of buffing him even a little bit, making him way too strong, was speculative. It's crazy how they were acting so cautious in this regard, yet they released Phoenix and Monk as some of the most obviously broken overpowered cards in Clash Royale history. Even as Phoenix and Monk were toned down in the coming months, we wouldn't really see Goblin Giant return to its pre-October 2022 range. It was pretty widely agreed at this point that it needed a buff, but what would be the best way to do it? One suggestion was simply giving it more health. Another interesting idea was giving it a third Spear Goblin. Spear Goblins came in 3 in their own card, 3 of them came in the Goblin Gang, and Goblin Hut spawns them in waves of 3, so why not make Goblin Giant consistent with that? I like the idea, but I think players underestimated how much adding just one unit would make. If this were to happen, swarms would be cleared so much faster. There'd be major interaction changes. Things like minions and spirits died in 3 Spear Goblin hits and not 2. Plus, I think they'd have to change the entire design of the sprite to make this happen, so it's not realistic. The question was, what was Supercell going to do? 2023 is where things were really going to shake up. In the first set of balance changes of the year, in February 2023, Goblin Giant would make an appearance for the first time in over 2 years. But they would buff it in a way I don't think anybody really saw coming. The backpack Spear Goblin's hit speed would be decreased from 1.7 to 1.5 seconds. This would not apply to Spear Goblins outside of the backpack. It was weird to separate them like this. I know they already destandardized them by increasing their range a while back, but they at least gave some lore reasoning to make that make sense. They're higher up, so the spears can travel farther before hitting the ground. Duh. But what was the reasoning these Spear Goblins threw faster? They don't really give an explanation. They just say they want to make his special features stand out even more. It did make the hit speed consistent with the Giant itself again though. I'm guessing they wanted to balance him this way because they were afraid just giving him a simple stat buff would lead to him stepping on Giant's toes. But this change wasn't going to help the core issue facing Goblin Giant right now, which was that so many high hit point, high damage dealers countered him efficiently. At least Supercell was giving him attention now though. A buff is a buff at the end of the day. It could only help. But ultimately it didn't help much. It pretty much put the card in the position it was in pre-October 2022. It still felt like it needed a bit more. And surprisingly, it wouldn't be long for Supercell to deliver on this. Kind of. In the next set of balance changes, on April 4th, 2023, Goblin Giant would be buffed again. But this would just be a buff to the Spear Goblin troop. Their range would be increased from 5 to 5.5 tiles. Obviously, the Backpack Spear Goblin range was already 5.5 tiles, but now the death units would also have that range. It was made consistent again, so I guess being higher up doesn't make a difference after all. This change was really meant for other cards, but because Spear Goblins exist in the Goblin Giant card, it had to be changed for consistency. This made almost no noticeable difference for the Goblin Giant because when it dies, it's usually within 5 tiles of something already, meaning those Spear Goblins don't need to even move. As a result, there was no noticeable change in the card's performance. It really just seemed like the devs weren't eager to make Goblin Giant thrive. They'd buff it just enough to keep it from being totally irrelevant and nothing more. That would be until August. On August 8th, 2023, Goblin Giant would receive another buff. This would be the third balance change in just 1 year. To put it into perspective, Goblin Giant received 3 balance changes from 2018 through 2022, so they were being way more active with it now. In this set of changes, his health was being increased by 6%. A health increase is what a lot of Goblin Giant players were advocating for, and I think for many, this felt long overdue. I think what prompted them to buff this card now was evolutions. Evolutions were introduced in June, and since then Goblin Giant was struggling even more. Evolved Barbarians specifically were really good at countering Goblin Giants, and none of the cards that had evolutions really supported Goblin Giant well. We can safely assume it's due to evolutions, because in Grand Challenges, where evolutions weren't playable yet, his rates were still pretty consistent with what they've been when they decided not to buff him for years. A 6% health increase is pretty good for a card that already has so much health, and Goblin Giant players were certainly happy. Almost immediately, Goblin Giant's usage shot up to the highest it's been in Grand Challenges since April 2020, and even in environments with evolutions it was doing pretty well. It seemed to be in a great position. A 6% use rate was just below average, and it still had a really good win rate. In September, evolutions would be added to Grand Challenges, and following that, his rates rose to an all-time high. This was the main deck that was thriving with Goblin Giant around this time. It was consistently one of the most played decks in September through October, but the developments wouldn't stop here. It was going to get crazy. In addition to this Sparky deck, this deck with the evolved Royal Recruits would become very popular in October, and you'll notice one glaring thing about this deck. Sparky isn't there, which was historically extremely rare up to this point. But the fact of the matter is that you didn't really need Sparky to clear paths for the Goblin Giant anymore. This deck had Rage and Arrows, which together were really good at helping to whittle down a lot of low HP units that the Goblin Giant spears could finish off. Goblin Giant and Rage had worked well together for years now, but after the damage buff in December 2022, you haven't seen Goblin Giant without it. Not to mention, the style of decks were more versatile, since you could use the arrows for Firecracker or Goblin Barrels or guaranteed tower damage. There were just better ways to clear lanes now. Sparky was still good, don't get me wrong, but Goblin Giant didn't need it anymore, and that should be considered a success. As I said before, a card should never have to rely on a single other card to be viable. However, although it was good to see Goblin Giant in some new decks, its rates were getting a little alarming. By the end of October, its use rate hit double digits, and it still had one of the highest win rates. It was creeping into nerf territory if it wasn't already. But they were nothing too absurd yet. In the meantime, Supercell was nerfing the problematic evolutions that supported these decks, as they can very well explain a sudden rise in other cards like Goblin Giant. But if they thought an Evolved Knight or Royal Recruit nerf would tone down Goblin Giant, they were mistaken. November would be the craziest month for Goblin Giant yet, as you started seeing it played in even more top decks. Firstly, we need to talk about the release of the Little Prince. Little Prince was another broken overpowered card that was released in November 2023, so you were seeing it in almost every top Goblin Giant deck in November. But you also had some decks that played around it, like this popular one with the Evolved Archers and Mega Knight. This one rose to being the most used deck in the game around the end of November, beginning of December. This environment really helped to bring out the potential in Goblin Giant. Goblin Giant officially became the most used win condition, appearing in more than a quarter of Grand Challenge decks by the end of November. It was getting ridiculous, and many players were frustrated, and with players being told there wouldn't be any balance changes in December, Goblin Giant Royale continued to tread on uninterrupted. Even though there wouldn't be any balance changes at the beginning of the December 2023 season, Clash Royale would have some unscheduled changes come along the December update, which came in the middle of the month. On December 13th, 2023, Goblin Giant would receive its first real nerf. I say real because it technically got its range reduced in 2019, but that was very small and not targeted towards Goblin Giant. This time, they were directly focusing on it and toning it down. Goblin Giant had never been a huge issue up until now. It's crazy that it took this long for a nerf to happen. It wouldn't be anything huge though, as unscheduled changes rarely are. All it would be is a reversion of the buff it got all the way back in January. The Backpack Spear Goblin's hit speed would be increased back to 1.7 seconds to be consistent with the normal Spear Goblins once again. I never understood why they decided to buff it that way in the first place. I'm glad they didn't go overboard with the nerf. I believe Goblin Giant was overpowered and needed a nerf, but I think a lot of its recent upsurge was thanks to Little Prince. It would have been easy to revert the health change and leave it to die, but they didn't do that. Following this change, Goblin Giant's rates were trickling down. By the end of 2023, it only had slightly above average rates. And with the balance changes in January nerfing a lot of the cards in Goblin Giant's best decks, they fell to right about average. Finally, they were at an average use rate with a win rate that wasn't ridiculously high. It was perfect, until the devs decided to add a second evolution slot. Following that event, which happened in February, Goblin Giant Sparky was surging in popularity, greatly benefiting from this extra slot. As a result, Goblin Giant and Sparky had some of the highest win rates in the game, with above average use rates. It had crept up once again, and this time Supercell wasted no time taking action, as in the March balance changes, Goblin Giant would be getting nerfed again. This time, his health was being decreased by 3%, a partial reversion of the previous health increase. It seemed like a standard change, but I actually don't like it. In the past, when they've balanced cards by changing their health and then partially reverted it, it's always left a card in a bad spot. We've seen that with Witch, Mighty Miner, and Knight for example. But I think players were getting kinda tired of this card, so I can see why they did this. For the first couple of months following this change, the stats seems to be okay. Goblin Giant Sparky was still common as you'd expect, but one interesting thing I noticed was that in April, you were seeing people play Giant Skeleton with the Goblin Giant. This was a time where Dagger Duchess was ruling the game, so having tanks in your deck was almost necessary, and some people found success in using these two together. Overwhelming the Duchess forced you to play in a way like we hadn't seen before, so crazy strategies like including two tanks that seemingly had no synergy was one method found to work pretty consistently. However, in May, after all the evolutions were nerfed, we saw a massive drop off in Goblin Giant's rates. It was actually kind of jarring to see how quickly they fell and just how bad they were. It was certainly one of the, if not the worst win conditions again. You weren't seeing it used competitively whatsoever. The evolution supporting it had clearly been the bigger issue, and now Goblin Giant had to suffer because those evolutions were worse now. By June, it had one of the worst performances of any card in the game. It was arguably in the worst state it's ever been in. Even if it was technically better stat-wise than it was upon release, the environment was undoubtedly multiple times worse now. It needed help for sure, so it would get some. On June 17th, 2024, the Spear Goblin's first hit attack time would go from half a second to 3/10 of a second. Once again, this change wasn't really directed towards the Goblin Giant. It would make virtually no difference for this card. The path ahead was looking dark. Supercell had been so quick to buff this card in the past when it really needed it, and now it needed help more than ever, so why weren't they buffing it properly now? Well, there may have been a reason for holding off giving it a proper buff as we would see in July. On July 1st, 2024, Goblin Giant would evolve, bringing it a fresh breath of new life. This card had been carried by evolutions for nearly a year, but now with the other evolutions not being able to support it as well, it had to support itself with its own evolution. The concept for this one was very simple, but interesting. Everything about it was the same as the normal Goblin Giant, but when it had less than 50% of its health, it would spawn a goblin every 1.5 seconds. Not a spear goblin, a stab goblin. The goblin troop that up to this point had no association with the Goblin Giant. It could spawn these units indefinitely as long as it was alive and had less than 50% of its health, and you only had to cycle the regular Goblin Giant once to get to the evolved version. It really forced the defender to wipe out the Goblin Giant quick or else they could get overwhelmed. Also, on a side tangent, before we get to how it was in game, I wanted to talk about something I was always confused about. In the card icon and render, it actually shows 3 spear goblins despite it only having 2. Evolutions used to be way stronger than their base counterparts until just a few months prior, so it makes me wonder if there was going to be a 3rd spear goblin at one point, but then was scrapped because it would just be too much now, and they didn't update the renders that were already done. It definitely seems like there was some interesting development history we're not aware of. I have to assume that 3 spear goblins on the evolved Goblin Giant was highly considered at one point though regardless. Players were just as excited for this evolution as they've been, and it definitely brought some interest back into the card. First impressions seemed to be that this evolution was fairly balanced. It could be really strong in the right circumstance, but it wasn't that impressive. If countered properly, it would only spawn 2 or 3 goblins, which likely wouldn't do much. You had to properly support the evolved Goblin Giant for it to get value, and there's 2 cards in specific that were excellent in assisting it. One was the Rage spell. We've seen Goblin Giant and Rage together for a while now, as I've stated many times, but they worked even better now with the evolution. Not only did Rage help the Giant move and attack faster and the Backpack Spear Goblins attack faster, but it also sped up the spawn rate of the goblins and then the movement and attack speed of the goblins it spawned. Normally, the evolved Goblin Giant spawned a goblin every 1.5 seconds, but with the Rage boosting it, it spawned one about every 1.1 seconds. Evolved Goblin Giant got so much value from just existing, so helping it exist faster was more beneficial than it would be for most cards. The Zap, more specifically the evolved version, was also seen a lot with it. Thanks to its triple stun and massive radius, it could keep the Goblin Giant alive much longer thanks to it being able to wipe out a lot of fragile units and significantly delay heftier ones from taking it out. It was certainly viable, but didn't feel like too much, which was a good position to be in. The following month, we would see a rise though, as new decks began to trend with it. This one was somewhat popular, and I found it interesting because it didn't have the Royal Recruits, Rage, or Sparky, but the one that was really important is this Goblin Giant Double Prince deck. This deck was so good that even in a special game mode where you could use 8 evolutions, this was one of the, if not the best deck in the challenge despite it only containing 3 cards with an evolution. You had so much to help clear the path for the Goblin Giant. It was actually in a really good spot for an evolution because if you didn't play it right, it'd barely get more value than a regular Goblin Giant, which is how a card should be. You shouldn't just be able to shove it into anything and spam it. This deck would get nerfed in October though, and you saw another drop in Goblin Giant usage, but it was still hanging in there. The meta was still weird, and October through November would just happen to be an environment where Goblin Giant wasn't as good. In December though, this would change. We would get a new tower troop, the Royal Chef, and this was going to help Goblin Giant a lot. His gimmick was that he would level up friendly troops periodically. Specifically, he would target the unit with the highest hit points on the map. Since Goblin Giant typically had the most hit points of any card in any deck he was played in, Royal Chef would target him often, which was good. Because not only was the Goblin Giant's damage and health increased from this, but every single goblin he summoned would also be one level higher. And in case you didn't know, a goblin that is one level higher than the Princess Tower will take 3 shots to die instead of 2, which is huge, obviously. Evolved Goblin Giant and Royal Chef had a natural synergy, and it was discovered quickly. By the end of December, every Goblin Giant user was using the Royal Chef. You were seeing Evolved P.E.K.K.A used with it a lot as it synergized with the new Tower Troop as well. It was also just overall strong, and you had also been seeing this duo together sometimes already since the P.E.K.K.A Evolutions edition in September. They were so powerful together, you can see the popular decks that included them were mostly cheap, allowing you to cycle and thus play them much more. But despite all of this, Goblin Giant only had slightly above average rates. It wasn't too bad on its own, and the developments would only continue into the new year. 2025 kicked off with a massive set of balance changes where once again, although it wasn't focused on directly, Goblin Giant would get caught in the crossfire. Spear Goblins were getting a slight increase to their first hit attack time, a partial reversion from the June buff, but January's real notable development wouldn't come until January 21st, where a new card, the Rune Giant, would get buffed. Like the Royal Chef, this card's main gimmick was supporting friendly troops, but in a different way. Rather than leveling up cards, it would simply increase their damage every third attack. How would this disproportionately benefit Goblin Giant, you may wonder? Well, it could only buff 2 troops at a time. But even though Goblin Giant only counted as one of those 2 troops, the Giant plus both Spear Goblins counted as their own entities when it came to getting the damage bonus, so you were essentially getting triple the value. Rune Giant could buff 2 Spear Goblins, or a Goblin Giant that included 2 Spear Goblins plus another thing. She made it a lot more threatening. The Rune Giant's damage buff was fixed, so low damage dealers like Spear Goblins and Goblin Giant benefited the most from it. So they were a great pairing. Once again, you saw a major spike in Goblin Giant usage. In fact, this is when it managed to hit its all-time height of popularity. Nearly 3 in 10 Grand Challenge decks were including him after the Rune Giant buff, making him easily the most used troop card. This variant in particular was extremely popular, at one point making up more than 2% of all the decks that were being played in the entire game. If you combined the Royal Chef, Rune Giant, and Rage together, Goblin Giant became the scariest thing you could encounter. Goblin Giant was just built perfectly to synergize well with all of these cards like no other card could. Goblin Giant was always weird. It used to only work with Sparky, who for most of her life was never meta herself. He never had a lot of synergizers that could utilize his strengths up until recently, but over time, with new additions, it found its place. It just seemed to arrive in the game a little too early. He had risen so fast unexpectedly, and obviously it was a major problem now, so it wouldn't be long before he faced the wrath of Supercell. Even before the end of the season, Supercell was taking action. On January 31st, there was a change that made it so that Rune Giant's buffs would not affect the Spear Goblins in the Giant's backpack, only the Giant itself. Then on February 4th, we got a standard set of balance changes. The Royal Chef was completely destroyed, making it no longer competitively viable. And on top of both of these, the Evolved Goblin Giant was nerfed for the first time directly, increasing its spawn speed from 1.5 to 1.8 seconds. It's pretty impressive that this evolution had gone over 6 months without really needing a buff or a nerf. Most evolutions don't survive more than a month or 2 in their vanilla state. Supercell explains the direct nerf to Goblin Giant was necessary because Royal Chef was a synergistic tower troop, essentially meaning that even in a balanced state, Royal Chef would make Goblin Giant too strong. I kind of wish they would have waited to see where Goblin Giant settled after the Royal Chef nerf though, because they did the same thing with the Elixir Pump and Dagger Duchess in 2024 and ended up just killing both of them. Anyway though, that's pretty much the last major development we would see from Goblin Giant. Its use rate fell to be in about 3 to 5% of Grand Challenges with a solid win rate. But what types of decks has it appeared in since obliterating its former new best synergizers? Well, back to the classics. Goblin Giant had been on an interesting journey the last few months, meeting new friends to help him push to his limits. But now, old reliable Sparky was his only option again. And to this day, that's pretty much all you see him in. Goblin Giant received a 1 hit point increase in March, but that was just a rounding error fix. I doubt we're going to see anything major anytime soon. Goblin Giant has proven to be wildly unstable given the right synergizers, and even though it's really only seen with Sparky, that's okay. Him settling down into a more niche role might be better for the game overall, as now, we do know what a Goblin Giant dominated meta looks like. One sad thing about Goblin Giant though is that he's actually the only win condition to never finish number 1 in the world. He's gotten close a few times during his peaks, but could never quite make it. It's unfortunate the Rune Giant nerf came before the end of the January season because I think that would have been his time. But at least he's gotten his share of time in the spotlight, and you never know, maybe he'll get another chance to shine one day. Anyway though, let me know what you think about the Goblin Giant and if you think he needs another buff. Also let me know which card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.